There's a woman standing at the counter of a pawn shop, and she's holding out her wedding ring, not because her marriage is over, because the water bill is 3 weeks late, the car needs a part she can't afford, and this is the only thing in her house left that anyone would actually pay cash for on the spot. The man behind the counter has seen this exact scene 1,000 times, and he barely reacts. He picks up the ring, turns it under the light, names a number that's insultingly low, and she takes it anyway, because insultingly low is still more than 0. She drives home with an envelope of cash and an empty finger, and somewhere on that drive, something in her finally breaks, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, exhausted decision that this is the last time this is ever going to happen to her. That decision, made by thousands of different people, in thousands of different pawn shops, kitchen tables, and parked cars over the years, is where this entire story actually begins. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about debt when you're first getting into it. It never arrives all at once. It arrives one reasonable decision at a time, a decision so small in the moment that agreeing to it barely even feels like a decision at all. And by the time it's big enough to notice, big enough to trade a wedding ring for grocery money, it doesn't feel like a problem you caused. It feels like a storm that happened to you. Here's the sentence that's going to challenge nearly everything you've been taught to believe about money for the rest of this video, and honestly, probably for a long time after it ends. Debt isn't a storm that happens to you. It's a system built and sold to you on purpose by people who profit enormously from you believing it's simply how adult life works. And the man who's going to walk us through exactly how that system operates and exactly how ordinary, exhausted, pawn shop visiting families managed to break out of it isn't some untouchable financial guru who's never actually struggled. He lost everything first, every bit of it, in a single brutal stretch of years that very nearly ended his marriage and his sanity along with it. And it's precisely because he lost everything that what he eventually built actually works in real kitchens, for real families, not just on a whiteboard in front of a camera. His name is Dave Ramsey, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why he believes intensity beats intelligence when it comes to money, why the smartest mathematical plan on paper is often the exact plan that fails in real life, and why one specific idea from the African savannah, of all places, became the emotional engine behind an entire movement of people clawing their way out of debt. Stick around for that last part, because it's stranger and more useful than it sounds. Let's go back to where Dave Ramsey's own story actually starts, because you can't understand the plan without understanding the collapse that created it. In his 20s, Ramsey was, by almost any measure, a success story already in progress. He built a real estate portfolio using leverage, meaning borrowed money, that had grown to roughly $4 million in value, an extraordinary achievement for someone still in his 20s. He had the confidence that tends to come with fast, early success, the kind of confidence that convinces you the rules that apply to other people probably don't apply to you. And then, almost overnight, the ground shifted. A bank that had been financing much of his portfolio was sold to a new owner, and the new owner made a decision that would completely upend Ramsey's life. They wanted their loans called in, meaning paid back in full far sooner than anyone had planned for. Ramsey didn't have that kind of cash sitting around, because none of it had ever really been his cash in the first place. It had all been borrowed, leveraged, stacked on top of itself in a structure that looked impressive, right up until someone pulled a single thread and the whole thing came apart at once. Within a shockingly short period of time, he went from a young millionaire on paper to a man facing bankruptcy, with a wife and a newborn baby at home, and a level of humiliation he still describes, decades later, as one of the hardest experiences of his entire life. He talks about the specific moment it became real to him, sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills he had no way to pay, and feeling something crack open inside him that had nothing to do with math and everything to do with shame. That collapse is the actual origin point of everything we're about to walk through together. Because Ramsey didn't build his method by studying other people's mistakes from a safe distance. He built it by clawing his own way back up, one uncomfortable decision at a time, and paying close, obsessive attention to exactly which decisions actually worked and which ones were just noise. Here's the first idea worth sitting with, because it's going to reframe almost everything that follows. Ramsey came out of that collapse, believing something most financial institutions have spent decades and enormous marketing budgets convincing us isn't true. He came to believe that debt itself, not just excessive debt, not just bad debt, but debt in general, is fundamentally dangerous, a tool that overwhelmingly benefits the lender, not the borrower, no matter how it's dressed up or marketed. He calls this idea normal, and he means it as an insult, not a compliment, because normal, in his framing, quietly means broke. Normal means a car payment that never actually ends, because the moment one car is finally paid off, a slightly newer car and a brand new payment mysteriously appear right behind it. Normal means a credit card balance that gets paid down a little, only to creep right back up the next time life throws something unexpected at you. Normal means retirement accounts, sitting nearly empty year after year, because there's never quite enough left over once every single debt payment has been made. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it certainly unsettled Ramsey once he really looked at it clearly. An entire, enormously profitable industry has been built specifically around convincing ordinary people that this is simply how life works, that debt is a completely normal, unavoidable part of being a responsible adult. Let's meet a couple who came to one of Ramsey's early seminars, given the names Marcus and Renee in his retelling, because their story is the kind that quietly repeats itself in millions of households, with the details changed, but the shape staying almost identical. Marcus and Renee had a household income most people would consider genuinely comfortable, solidly middle class, nothing extravagant, but certainly enough to live well. And yet they were living paycheck to paycheck, with a mountain of consumer debt that had built up slowly, almost invisibly, over roughly a decade of completely ordinary decisions. A slightly nicer car here, financed because the payment seemed manageable at the time. A vacation charged to a credit card because, as Renee put it later, they felt like they'd earned it after a hard year. Furniture purchased on a store credit card with promotional financing that quietly converted into a punishing interest rate the moment a single detail in the fine print got missed. None of these decisions, taken on their own, seemed reckless in the moment. That, according to Ramsey, is precisely what makes debt so dangerous in the first place. It almost never arrives as one single, obviously catastrophic decision. It arrives as dozens of small, completely forgivable ones, each one easy to justify at the exact moment it's made, each one nearly invisible until you finally add them all together and see the real number staring back at you. So, what's Ramsey's actual solution to all of this? It's not moderation. It's not a slightly reduced credit card balance or a gentler, more comfortable payment plan stretched out over a few extra years. His solution, and this is genuinely what makes his entire approach so different from almost every other financial philosophy out there, is total, aggressive, deeply uncomfortable intensity. He argues that half measures fail consistently, predictably, because they simply don't create enough emotional urgency to actually change deeply ingrained behavior. A family that quietly decides to cut back a little rarely follows through for long, because a little discomfort is remarkably easy to rationalize away the very first time life gets stressful again. But a family that goes all in, that treats debt elimination like an actual emergency, like the house is genuinely on fire, behaves in a completely different way. They sell things they don't strictly need. They pick up a second job, temporarily, with a clear end date in mind. They eat rice and beans, quite literally, a phrase that becomes something of a badge of honor throughout Ramsey's teaching, a symbol of short-term, deliberate sacrifice in exchange for long-term, durable freedom. Now here's where that African savannah comes in. The strange little detail I promised you earlier, because it turns out to explain the entire emotional engine underneath everything Ramsey teaches. Picture a gazelle grazing calmly on the open plain. Somewhere in the distance, a cheetah begins to move. And the moment that gazelle senses the danger, something extraordinary happens inside its body. It doesn't jog away at a comfortable, sustainable pace. It runs with everything it has, every single muscle firing at once, because on the African savannah, a comfortable, sustainable pace gets you killed. Ramsey uses this image deliberately, calling the intensity required to escape debt gazelle intensity. And the comparison isn't just colorful language for the sake of it. It's making a very specific, very serious point. Most people approach debt payoff the way a person might jog gently on a treadmill, comfortable, sustainable, easy to maintain indefinitely. But comfortable and sustainable, Ramsey argues, is exactly the pace that keeps people trapped in debt for decades, sometimes for their entire lives, because a slow, gentle pace never actually creates enough urgency to fully change deeply ingrained behavior. The families who actually break free, the ones whose stories fill his seminars and his radio show year after year, are the ones who, for a defined, temporary period, run like that gazelle, full intensity, genuine discomfort, because they understand, on some level, that a predator really is closing in the form of interest charges, quietly compounding in the background, month after month, year after year, whether they're paying attention to it or not. This is the emotional engine underneath everything that follows, and it's genuinely worth sitting with for a moment before we move into the actual mechanics of the plan itself. Getting out of debt was never primarily a math problem. It's a behavior problem, and behavior doesn't change through spreadsheets alone. It changes through urgency, through discomfort, sharp enough to actually interrupt habits that have been running quietly on autopilot for years. Now, before we walk through the actual steps of Ramsey's plan, I want you to pause and ask yourself something honestly, with absolutely no one else listening in. If you added up every single payment you're currently making right now, every card, every loan, every completely normal monthly obligation, would you honestly call your financial life calm? Or would you call it merely survivable? Because those turn out to be two very different things, and most people, quietly, without ever fully admitting it to themselves, are only managing to do the second one. Before Ramsey ever introduces his famous step-by-step system, he spends real time on something most financial books skip over entirely: the emotional stages people typically move through before they're actually ready to make a real change. He calls it the process of denial, and it plays out in stages that will feel uncomfortably familiar if you've ever tried, and quietly failed, to fix your own finances before. The first stage is denial itself, simply refusing to look closely at the actual numbers at all. This is the person who knows, somewhere in the back of their mind, that the credit card balance is genuinely bad, but keeps avoiding opening the statement, avoiding checking the app, avoiding doing the math, because as long as the exact number stays unknown, it somehow feels slightly less real. There's a man in one of Ramsey's stories who avoided checking his own credit card balance for nearly 8 months straight, not because he couldn't access it, but because some part of him had decided that not knowing was easier to live with than knowing. The second stage is anger, and it tends to surface right around the moment the numbers finally do become impossible to ignore any longer, often triggered by a missed payment, a rejected loan application, or one blunt, uncomfortable conversation with a spouse at exactly the wrong moment. Ramsey describes people in this stage blaming everything and everyone except themselves: the bank for raising the interest rate without warning, the broader economy, a job that never quite paid enough to begin with. And while some of those factors might genuinely be real and worth acknowledging, staying stuck in the anger stage indefinitely guarantees that nothing actually changes, because you simply cannot fix a problem you've quietly convinced yourself is entirely someone else's fault. The third stage is bargaining, and this is where Ramsey has watched some of the most well-intentioned people quietly fail, over and over. This is the family that decides to budget a little better, without any real structure behind that decision, or commits to paying a little extra toward debt each month without ever actually addressing the underlying spending that created the debt in the first place. It feels like genuine progress in the moment. It creates the comforting appearance of real change, but without actual structure underneath it. Ramsey argues, bargaining almost always quietly collapses the moment life gets stressful again, because there was never a real system holding up the good intentions in the first place. The fourth and final stage is what Ramsey calls the turning point, the exact moment a person or a couple decides, with total, unmistakable clarity, that they are simply done living this way. And that decision, more than any specific tactic or spreadsheet, is the actual beginning of everything that. To all. There's a story of a woman named Denise, a single mother who had spent years quietly stuck in the bargaining stage, making small, well-meaning efforts, feeling slightly better for a few months at a time, then gradually sliding back into old, familiar patterns. Her turning point didn't arrive through some dramatic financial event. It arrived through something small and painfully human, sitting outside her daughter's school in her car, realizing she genuinely couldn't afford the modest field trip fee that every other parent around her seemed to pay without a second thought. That single moment of quiet humiliation became the spark that pushed her from bargaining into total, unmistakable commitment, and within 2 years, using the exact system we're about to walk through together, she had eliminated over $30,000 of debt entirely on her own. Ramsey's point in walking through these stages so carefully is simple but genuinely important. You cannot skip straight to the tactics. If you're still stuck in denial, or still simmering in anger, or still quietly bargaining without any real structure underneath it, the steps that follow won't work, no matter how well designed they are on paper, because the tactics only ever work once the underlying decision is genuinely real. So here's the pause. I want you to actually sit in for a moment, honestly. Which of these 4 stages are you actually in right now? If you're being completely truthful with yourself, there's no shame in any of them. Ramsey himself lived through every single one before he ever rebuilt his own life from the wreckage of that early collapse. But naming exactly which stage you're standing in right now is the first genuine step toward the one that actually changes everything that comes after it. Once a person finally reaches that turning point, Ramsey gives them something concrete to hold on to, a sequence of specific steps followed strictly in order that form the entire backbone of his method. He calls them the baby steps, and the name is deliberate. They're simple enough that literally anyone can understand them at a glance, but the order matters enormously, and skipping ahead, even with the very best of intentions, is one of the most common reasons people quietly fail partway through. The first step is saving a modest starter emergency fund as quickly as humanly possible, enough to cover the small, inevitable surprises of daily life without immediately reaching for a credit card. This isn't meant to cover every conceivable disaster. It's meant to cover the small one, a car repair, a broken appliance, an unexpected medical copay, the kinds of costs that would otherwise get thrown straight onto a card and quietly restart the entire debt cycle before it's even had a chance to shrink. The second step is the one most closely associated with Ramsey's entire philosophy, something called the debt snowball. And we're going to spend real time on this one specifically, because it's both the most famous part of his method and, honestly, the most misunderstood. The third step is building a fully funded emergency fund, typically 3 to 6 months of living expenses. Once every single piece of consumer debt beyond the mortgage has been completely eliminated. The fourth step involves investing a meaningful percentage of household income toward long-term retirement. The fifth step, for families who need it, involves saving specifically for children's future education. The sixth step is paying off the home mortgage itself, aggressively, treating even a standard 30-year mortgage as a debt to be eliminated as quickly as possible, rather than simply accepting it as a permanent fixture of adult life. And the seventh and final step, the reward phase at the very end of the sequence, is building real wealth and giving generously, because at that point, having eliminated every financial obligation, except ordinary taxes, a family finally has complete, total control over every single dollar they earn. There's a couple in Ramsey's teaching, given the names the Bakers, who spent years trying to work on several of these steps simultaneously, adding a little to savings here, investing a little in retirement there, paying a little extra toward debt somewhere else, all at the exact same time, and it genuinely felt responsible while they were doing it. But because their effort was spread thin across so many directions at once, none of it ever built enough real momentum to actually feel like progress. And after 3 full years of this scattered approach, their total debt had barely moved at all. The moment they finally restructured everything around Ramsey's strict order, pausing retirement contributions temporarily, focusing entirely on the starter emergency fund, and then the debt snowball, one thing at a time, their intensity multiplied almost overnight, and what 3 scattered years hadn't managed to accomplish, 18 genuinely focused months finally did. This is the core insight sitting underneath the entire baby steps framework, and it's worth repeating clearly because it applies far beyond just personal finance. Focus consistently beats balance when you're in genuine crisis mode. Trying to pursue 5 financial goals adequately all at once often means accomplishing none of them meaningfully, while sequencing them one at a time, with full and complete intensity, creates a kind of momentum that scattered, divided effort simply cannot replicate. Now, let's slow down and really dig into that second step, the debt snowball, because this is where Ramsey's method becomes genuinely, publicly controversial, and understanding exactly why he built it this way is going to change how you think about debt for a very long time. If you've spent any real time around personal finance content, you've probably run into this exact debate before. Mathematically speaking, when you're carrying multiple debts, the most efficient order to pay them off is by interest rate, highest rate first, because that approach minimizes the total amount of interest you'll pay over the entire life of the debt. Financial experts often call this the debt avalanche, and on a spreadsheet, purely on the numbers, it's genuinely the more mathematically optimal method. No argument there. Ramsey rejects it anyway, and his reasoning is, honestly, the single most psychologically insightful part of his entire teaching. He argues that personal finance is roughly 20% head knowledge and 80% raw behavior, and the debt avalanche, while mathematically sound, consistently fails out in the real world because it doesn't provide the emotional wins people genuinely need to stay motivated across months, sometimes years, of real sacrifice. Instead, Ramsey built what he calls the debt snowball, a method that deliberately, intentionally ignores interest rates altogether, and instead orders every debt from smallest balance to largest, completely regardless of how much interest any particular one is actually carrying. Here's exactly how it works in practice. List out every debt you currently have, excluding only the mortgage, from the smallest balance all the way up to the largest. Make only the minimum required payment on every single one of them, except the very smallest. Attack that smallest debt with absolutely every extra dollar you can possibly find, selling things you don't need, trimming expenses wherever possible, picking up temporary extra work if necessary, until it's completely, entirely paid off. Then take the full payment you were making on that first debt and roll it, combined with the minimum payment, directly onto the next smallest balance, creating a new payment that's now noticeably larger than it was before. Repeat that exact process, debt after debt after debt, and watch the payment grow larger and larger with each one, exactly like an actual snowball rolling downhill, gathering size and momentum with every single rotation, until by the time you reach the final debt, often the largest one on the entire list, you're throwing an enormous, almost startling payment at it, built entirely from the freed-up payments of everything you've already eliminated along the way. There's a man in Ramsey's teaching named Curtis who had 6 completely separate debts, ranging from a modest $200 medical bill all the way up to a $22,000 car loan. A strictly mathematical approach would have told Curtis to attack that car loan first, since it carried by far the highest interest rate of the group. Instead, following the snowball method exactly as designed, he paid off the small $200 medical bill within a single week. Then, a $400 balance the following month. Then, an $800 credit card balance just 2 months after that. By the time Curtis finally reached the large car loan, he had already completely eliminated 4 separate debts in under 6 months, and more importantly than the math itself, he had proven to himself repeatedly in a relatively short amount of time that he was genuinely capable of finishing exactly what he started. Ramsey argues that this string of quick, tangible wins does something a slower, mathematically optimal approach simply cannot do. It builds real belief, and belief, sustained across the months or sometimes years it genuinely takes to eliminate 5 figures of debt, is very often the actual difference between someone who sees the plan through to the end and someone who quietly, gradually abandons it somewhere around month 4, right when the initial motivation starts to fade and the sacrifice begins to feel permanent instead of temporary. Yes, Curtis technically paid a small amount of extra interest by not attacking the highest rate debt first, but Ramsey's argument, backed by literally thousands of families he's personally walked through this exact process over the years, is that those few extra dollars of interest are a genuinely worthwhile trade for a method people actually stick with all the way to completion. Because a mathematically perfect plan that gets abandoned in month 5 is worth far less in the end than an imperfect plan that actually gets finished. This is one of the most important ideas in all of personal finance, honestly, and it extends well beyond just debt itself. The best financial plan was never the one that looks smartest on paper. It's the one you'll actually follow when motivation fades and life inevitably gets hard. And Ramsey built his entire method around designing for real human behavior, not theoretical mathematical optimization. Here's a moment worth pausing on and thinking through honestly. Where else in your own financial life have you chosen the smart option that you never actually followed through on over the simpler option you would have genuinely stuck with? Sometimes the perfect plan you quietly abandon is worth far less than the good plan you actually finish. Now, here's a chapter of Ramsey's teaching that rarely gets the attention it deserves, something he calls exposing the myths. And it's genuinely worth walking through, because these myths are still repeated as common sense today, decades after he first started pushing back against them. The first myth is the idea that you need a credit card to build credit, and therefore to function as a responsible adult in modern society. Ramsey pushes back on this hard, pointing out that an entire industry has a massive financial incentive to keep this belief alive, because every swipe, every carried balance, every missed payment quietly generates profit for someone else, almost never for the person holding the card. The second myth involves co-signing, the seemingly generous act of putting your own name on someone else's loan to help them qualify. There's a story in his teaching about a father who co-signed a car loan for his adult son, purely out of love, fully expecting his son to make every payment responsibly and on time. Within a year, the son had missed several payments. The debt collectors were calling the father directly instead of the son, and the father's own credit had been damaged by a loan he was never actually driving for a car he didn't even own. Ramsey's rule on this is blunt and, honestly, refreshingly simple. If you co-sign a loan, you should genuinely expect to pay the entire balance yourself, because statistically, an enormous percentage of co-signed loans eventually do fall back onto the co-signer, one way or another. The third myth involves extended warranties, those add-on protection plans offered at checkout for nearly every major purchase you'll ever make. Ramsey argues that these are almost always a poor use of money. The fourth myth involves a specific type of life insurance called whole life insurance, which combines a death benefit with a savings component, bundled together and sold as a single product. There's a story of a young couple who were sold a whole life policy by a friendly, well-meaning agent, paying a significant monthly premium for years before ever realizing that a simple term, life policy, covering the exact same death benefit would have cost them a small fraction of what they were actually paying, freeing up hundreds of dollars a month they could have redirected straight into their own debt, snowball instead. Ramsey's broader point across every one of these myths is remarkably consistent, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. An enormous amount of conventional financial wisdom wasn't handed down by wise elders looking out for your best interests. It was built, marketed, and quietly reinforced by industries that profit directly from you believing it, and untangling which financial habits are genuinely good for you versus which ones simply sound responsible while quietly benefiting someone else is one of the most valuable skills this entire method teaches. Once the debt snowball is finally complete, something interesting happens in Ramsey's teaching. A real shift in the entire emotional tone of everything that follows, and it's worth noticing carefully because it reveals something important about his broader philosophy that goes well beyond simply eliminating debt. He describes what he calls the fully funded emergency fund, typically 3 to 6 months of living expenses sitting completely untouched in a separate, easily accessible savings account, and he treats this particular step with almost as much intensity as the original debt payoff itself. Why would an emergency fund matter so much to a man whose entire public brand is built around aggressive financial intensity? Because Ramsey has genuinely lived through exactly what happens without one. He returns to his own story here from a slightly different angle, and points out that the real disaster in his own collapse wasn't really the debt itself. It was the complete absence of any cushion whatsoever between his family and total catastrophe. The moment the bank called in every one of his loans all at once, with absolutely nothing set aside to absorb the shock. There's a family in his teaching who successfully completed the entire debt snowball, felt an enormous, genuine surge of pride and relief, and then, without a fully funded emergency fund yet in place, got hit unexpectedly by a job loss and found themselves reaching for a credit card again within just a few months, quietly undoing years of hard-won progress in a matter of weeks. The emergency fund, in Ramsey's framework, isn't merely a financial tool sitting quietly in a savings account. It's a genuine psychological firewall, a buffer that fundamentally transforms how a person experiences unexpected bad news when it inevitably arrives. There's a story of a family who, years after finishing their own debt snowball, had their primary income earner unexpectedly lose his job during a sudden company-wide layoff. Because they already had 3 full months of expenses sitting safely in savings. That layoff, while genuinely stressful, was not a catastrophe. It was survivable, manageable, even, in a strange way, almost calm, in a manner that would have been completely impossible for that same family just 5 years earlier, when the identical layoff would have triggered an immediate spiral straight back into fresh debt within weeks. This is the deeper argument Ramsey is really making across this entire back half of his teaching, and it's easy to miss if you're only focused on the debt elimination tactics themselves. The entire system was never really just about hating debt for its own sake. It's about buying back something Ramsey calls peace, the ability to genuinely absorb life's inevitable shocks, a lost job, a sudden medical bill, a broken transmission, without those shocks cascading into years of renewed financial stress all over again. So, here's a question worth actually sitting with for a moment, something most people never stop to calculate specifically. What would it genuinely feel like? Not hypothetically, but specifically, right now, if your mortgage, your car payment, and every single credit card balance simply didn't exist anymore? Not what would you buy with the extra money. What would actually change about how you sleep at night, how you feel the moment you open your banking app, how you respond the next time your car makes an unfamiliar noise on the highway? That feeling, according to Ramsey, is the actual prize at the end of all of this, and it's genuinely available to almost anyone willing to endure the discomfort required to get there. Now, let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the truth is, this teaching is decades old at this point, and the tools working against the average person's finances today have multiplied and become significantly more invisible than they were back then. When Ramsey first began teaching this method, the primary tool keeping families trapped in debt was the credit card, a single, relatively visible product that at least required a conscious decision to apply for and actively carry around in your wallet. Today, the landscape working against the average person's finances has changed shape entirely. Buy now, pay later services let you split nearly any purchase into small installments with a single tap at checkout. No application, no hard credit check, no genuine moment of friction that might make you pause and reconsider before completing the purchase. Just a handful of quiet payments spread across a few weeks that feel, psychologically, like spending far less money than you actually are. Ramsey's core argument that debt gets normalized specifically because entire industries profit directly from that normalization has, if anything, become even more true, not less. In the years since he first started teaching this material, the debt snowball still works exactly the way it always did, because it was never really about interest rates in the first place. It was about behavior, and human behavior hasn't fundamentally changed, even as the tools around us have become dramatically more sophisticated at bypassing our natural hesitation before we spend. Here's the modern application, worth genuinely acting on this week, something concrete you can actually do in the next 24 hours, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort of it. List out every single recurring or installment obligation currently sitting in your financial life right now, not just credit cards and traditional loans, but every buy now, pay later plan, every subscription quietly tied to some form of financing, every 0% promotional balance sitting patiently in the background of your monthly spending, waiting to convert into real interest the moment you miss a single detail. Most people, when they actually sit down and complete this exercise properly, discover they have significantly more open obligations than they initially assumed, precisely because modern debt has been carefully engineered to feel invisible, spread across small, low-friction payments instead of one large, alarming number staring back at them from a single statement. Once you have that complete list sitting in front of you, apply the snowball exactly as Ramsey originally designed it. Smallest balance first, full intensity, one debt at a time, and watch the exact same psychological momentum that worked for families in the 1990s work just as powerfully for you today, because the method was never really about the specific financial products of any particular decade. It was always about proving to yourself, one small, tangible win at a time, that you are genuinely capable of finishing exactly what you start. Let's go back, one final time, to that woman standing at the pawnshop counter, holding out her wedding ring, trading it for an envelope of cash that barely covered the water bill. Her story didn't end there, and it's worth knowing exactly how it continued. 18 months after that afternoon at the pawnshop, following the exact sequence we've just walked through together, she made her very last debt payment on the smallest remaining balance, the final domino in a snowball that had been quietly building momentum for well over a year. She didn't celebrate with an expensive dinner or some lavish, well-earned trip. She sat at her own kitchen table, the same one where everything had started falling apart years earlier, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, opened her banking app to a balance that showed nothing owed to anyone at all. Just her own money, entirely her own, for the first time in years. And a few months after that, with her first fully funded emergency fund finally sitting in a separate account, she walked back into that same pawn shop, not to sell anything this time, but simply to look. And there, sitting quietly in a display case near the register, was a ring strikingly similar to the one she'd traded away all those years earlier. She didn't buy it. She didn't need to. She'd already gotten back the thing that actually mattered, which was never really the ring in the first place. It was the ability to make a choice, any choice, about her own money without desperation standing behind her shoulder, forcing her hand. That is the actual total money makeover, not some single dramatic transformation captured in a before and after photo, but a long sequence of small, deliberate, occasionally deeply uncomfortable decisions made consistently, in exactly the right order, until one day the debt that once felt completely permanent simply isn't there anymore. Debt was never a tool for building real wealth. It's exactly what Ramsey has always bluntly called it. And every single family in this story who broke free from it did so not through some sophisticated financial trick or a lucky break, but through simple, repeatable, almost boringly consistent behavior, sustained for long enough to actually work. If this idea, that behavior matters more than math, that momentum matters more than perfect optimization, resonated with you at all, because somewhere out there right now, there's another person standing at another counter, holding out something they never imagined they'd have to give up, quietly deciding, it isn't the end of their story. It never actually is. It's just the very first domino, waiting patiently for someone with enough intensity to finally knock it down.